before that, but it was about 300 years ago it started to become a strong movement again. John Wesley, who was the primary organizer and the most prominent organizer and leader of the Methodist movement back in the 18th century, he had a close association with a group of Christians called the Moravians. Now, the Moravians were Universalists, but Wesley didn't agree with them. In those early years, he argued with them, thought they were really wrong. But he continued his lifelong association with the Moravians, and it seems that they eventually wore him down. He too came to believe in Universalism late in his life. I love to tell United Methodists that John Wesley came to believe in Universalism late in his life. And that's because in the United Methodist Church, the most conservative people are ones who are most likely to reject the teaching of Universalism. At the same time, they often can be heard to say, let's go back and reestablish the teachings of John Wesley. And so he'd say, yeah, let's do that. Because he came to believe in Universalism. I'm getting myself confused here. Anyway, the American colonies proved to be a particularly fertile ground for the spread of the teaching of Universalism. George de Benneville came over from France in 1741 to Pennsylvania and did quite a bit to spread the teaching there. John Murray came over from England in 1770, and he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of Universalism throughout the American colonies. Now, it's quite remarkable that he worked with the Baptists, right? Mm-hmm. The Quakers, that's not too surprising, because a lot of Quakers are still quite receptive to the teaching of Universalism, although not all, unfortunately. But the Baptists, that's sort of a different situation. Things have changed, although there are Baptists who are still receptive, like the American Baptists, for example, especially the north, in the northern part of the country. But anyway, he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of Universalism. It was under John Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was organized. As in the time of the early church, there were strong women leaders in the early Universalist Church. There was Hannah Whitehall Smith and Olympia Brown also, who was ordained, the first woman to be ordained by any denomination. And she was ordained by the Universalist Church in the year 1863. And being a United Methodist, I thought we were doing pretty well when we started ordaining women in 1956. And which is, sadly, a lot of churches still don't ordain women. So I thought we were doing really well until I learned that the Universalists beat us by almost 100 years. Hallelujah, that's something to celebrate, to be sure. Jose Ballou was the most prominent and influential leader in the Universalist Church during his life and ministry. When he died in 1852, the Universalist Church had about 800,000 members. And so it was a strong movement, to be sure. The teaching of Universalism, though, hasn't been promoted only by Universalists or Unitarians, for that matter, but has been promoted by teachers and theologians, leaders of other denominations as well. For example, back in the 19th century, there was a German theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. I wonder how many here have heard of old Friedrich? Oh, that puts you well above average. I saw a couple, 2 or 3 hands. That puts you above average, because I say about 2 or 3% of the people I find have heard of old Friedrich. But so he wasn't a very well-known theologian, but he was a fine theologian and a strong advocate of Universalism. Besides that, I just like to say his name. Isn't that wonderful? Friedrich Schleiermacher. I mean, isn't that a wonderful name? I just love it. Anyway, then in the 20th century, there were some other theologians and leaders who taught Universalism, prominent people like Karl Barth and Paul Tillich, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Leslie Weatherhead, and many others. So Universalism has a long, rich history for more than 500 years following the time of Jesus, and then especially for the last 300 years as well. So you might wonder, why is this so important to me as a United Methodist minister? That's really not our official doctrine, to believe in Universalism, although there's a lot of us who believe it, and there's some of us who are willing to admit it openly, but I find there's a lot of closet Universalists in the United Methodist Church. They don't openly, or at least very willingly, admit it openly. But when you talk with them privately, a lot of them will admit they believe it. But anyway, so why is it that I wrote a book on the subject and travel around speaking about Universalism? Why is it so important? Well, it's because it seems to me that the teaching of a God of eternal damnation has prevailed for far too long in most churches and in our society at large, and with devastating consequences. One of the reasons this is so important to me is because the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. People know that they would never ever punish their own children without end. I mean, what an absurd concept even to consider. Nobody would even consider punishing their own children without end. And therefore, they just can't relate to a God who people say does that very same thing. So the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. Sometimes they become atheists. Now, I need to acknowledge that I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs, and I'm grateful. When I went on the road, or when Darlene and I went on the road in 2003, we were on the road full-time from 2003 to 2006, and now we've been doing it most of the time since then, half-time, while serving small churches in Iowa. Anyway, I've met a lot of wonderful atheists in UU churches. It's magnificent. And I thought I knew something about atheism before going on the road, and I knew a little, but not much. But one of the things I've learned that for atheists in UU churches, generally they find it to be a thoughtful, responsible, mature way to approach life, and it works for them. And so for people for whom atheism works, I really don't have a difficulty with that. In other denominations, though, when people become atheists, it's not often such a positive thing. And that is because they still have in the back of their mind the possibility of spending eternity in hell. And if they believe that there is no God to rescue them from that plight, they often conclude that they are doomed, and that leads to meaninglessness and despair. In a lot of churches, they have quite a good number of members who attend only at Christmas and Easter, and there's a good reason for that. It's because those are 2 times of celebration, and on those 2 times, there's little danger anybody's going to bring up anything about eternal damnation. And so it's not because they're too lazy to get up and go to church the rest of the time. It's because, they just don't want to hear that anymore. They've heard more damnation teaching than they care to hear about, and they're not going to take it anymore. And so they stay away from church except for Christmas and Easter, those 2 times of celebration when there's little danger anybody's going to bring up the eternal damnation teaching. Then there's perhaps close to half of the population that doesn't go to church at all, not even on Christmas and Easter. And I've talked with an awful lot of unchurched people, and they so often bring up the idea of unending suffering in hell that it obviously is an issue that weighs heavily upon them. And so they seem to instinctively reject the idea of a God who throws people into hell, kicking and screaming against their will, to punish them forever because they were naughty. I mean, that's a monster God. They also seem to instinctively reject the idea of a weak and a stupid and uncaring God who allows people to just sort of go floundering around through life and somehow of their own free will end up in hell, and then just to abandon them there. I mean, who in their right mind would want to serve a God like that? Either a monster God who throws people into hell against their will to torture them because they were naughty, or a weak and a stupid and uncaring God who either doesn't want to save everybody or doesn't have the ability to save everybody. In either case, it's not much of a God.